Today we'll be working in my workbook called Stephen the Martyr and Philip the Evangelist, which covers Acts 6 through 8. And so far, we have studied the first three chapters, which has to do with the appointment of the first seven deacons. And we start seeing Stephen with his power from the Holy Spirit and the things he's able to do. Then he gets into an argument with the Grecian Jews, and that brings him to stand in front of the Sanhedrin for his life. And so we have studied the first part of his speech. His speech might have been 15 minutes long, but we're going to take three whole chapters in order to understand it. We've heard the first part, which was when he talks about the history from Abraham to Joseph. So now we're going to do chapter 4 when he talks about Moses. So let's see. Stephen's speech to the Sanhedrin, part 2, Moses, Acts 7, 17 through 38.
As the time drew near for God to fulfill his promise to Abraham, the number of our people in Egypt had greatly increased. Then a new king to whom Joseph met nothing came to power in Egypt. He dealt treacherously with our people and opposed our ancestors by forcing them to throw out their newborn babies so that they would die.
When the time came for God to fulfill his promise, did life get easier or harder for the Israelites?
Harder.
How long had the Israelites lived in Egypt?
400 years.
How many Israelites originally came to Egypt?
75.
How many Israelites will leave Egypt during this time?
600,000.
Yeah, it was only one gender of babies that was ordered killed. Which gender was that?
Male.
Right. Why is Stephen retelling this history? Remember, he was accused of speaking against Moses, so now he's setting the stage for that defense.
At that time, Moses was born, and he was no ordinary child. For 3 months, he was cared for by his family. When he was placed outside, Pharaoh's daughter took him and brought him up as her own son. Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action.
No ordinary child is better translated in other Bibles as a beautiful child. Obviously, he was beautiful enough for the Pharaoh's daughter to fall in love with. In verse 22, Stephen gives us more information about Moses that's not in our Bible. Again, this knowledge is known and accepted by all. 1, placed outside is really ambiguous. What happened to Moses when he could no longer be cared for by his family?
He was put in a basket in the Nile River.
In verse 22, we learn many important things about Moses. Go ahead and fill those two.
Educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action.
How does verse 22 counter the impression that Moses had a speech impairment in Exodus 4:10?
Well, maybe because he was not able to speak very well because of the Hebrew language.
Right. I think you and I might have talked about this. A lot of people, when they just read Exodus 4:10, they assume that he has a speech impairment. We know that that isn't the truth because Stephen says he's educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and powerful in speech and action. The Egyptians would not have done that if he was handicapped in some way. So we think that the reason why he had a speech, he didn't want to, he couldn't speak was when he talked to God in Exodus 4, is that he's now looking at 3 different languages, Hebrew, Egyptian, and then Midian that he's been dealing with. And he hadn't had any experience with Hebrew and Egyptian for a long time because he had spent 40 years in the wilderness speaking Midian. So that's the reason why he hesitates to speak. He's not a great speaker, he says. Not that he has a speech impairment.
Right.
But we wouldn't have known that without Stephen emphasizing these things. How does this life make Moses uniquely qualified to lead his people?
Egyptian education and knowing how they think.
Right. He's a Hebrew with a full knowledge of Egyptian education. Yeah, he's uniquely qualified for this position, the same way that Paul is uniquely qualified for his work. And God takes us, becomes unique qualified in our position sometimes.
When Moses was 40 years old, he decided to visit his own people, the Israelites. He saw one of them being mistreated by an Egyptian, so he went to his defense and avenged him by killing the Egyptian. Moses thought that his own people would realize that God was using him to rescue them, but they did not. The next day, Moses came upon two Israelites who were fighting. He tried to reconcile them by saying, "Men, you are brothers. Why do you want to hurt each other?" But the man who was mistreating the other pushed Moses aside and said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday?"
Stephen gives us more information here that we don't have in the book of Exodus. First, that Moses was 40 years of age when he decided to visit his people. And second, that Moses already knew at this time that God was going to use him to save the Israelites. Those two things are not mentioned in Exodus. Stephen has now presented two Jewish leaders that were initially rejected by the Jews. In this passage, it's Moses. Who was it in Acts 7:9?
Joseph.
Why does Stephen use these two men in his defense?
Comparing their treatment to Jesus' treatment.
Exactly, yes. They were two people that highly respected in Jewish history, but yet they were rejected by their own people. Both Joseph and Moses had heard the call from God long before they were to use it. Perhaps knowing how God was going to use them kept them focused when times got tough. They also needed to wait on God's timing and their own maturity. In both cases, they fell for, I know what I'm supposed to do. Let me tell you what I'm supposed to do. You remember that? Moses did that. Joseph did that too when he told his brothers and his father and mother his dreams. I know what I'm supposed to do for the family. But they are given their vision way ahead of when they're supposed to work. And yes, that holds them knowing that God is going to use them, but they have to wait for being mature enough for God to use them in that way. So it's almost good not to know ahead of time what God's going to do with you. Because, like me, I don't usually get visions ahead of time. I do get visions for Gideon's and my role in Gideon's, and I want them now. I want to work now. I'm a Peter. I want now. And, I have to be patient for all timing to happen. But it's hard. It's almost better, I think, if you didn't know ahead of time.
Yeah.
Terry is more, when God calls him, he works, but he doesn't get any calls ahead of time. He just does what God says when he says it. That's it. And
Yeah.
I'm a planner, but Terry isn't.
Yeah. When Moses heard this, he fled to Midian,
Right.
where he settled as a foreigner and had two sons. After 40 years had passed, an angel appeared to Moses in the flames of a burning bush in the desert near Mount Sinai. When he saw this, he was amazed at the sight. As he went over to get a closer look, he heard the Lord say, "I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." Moses trembled with fear and did not dare to look.
Moses' wife was named Zipporah, who was not Jewish, and his sons were Gershom and Eleazar. His father-in-law was Jethro, who also was known as Ruel. Jethro was a priest of Midian. That just gives you some history there. Another 40 years have passed. How old is Moses now?
80.
It wasn't just an angel, but what?
Flames of a burning bush.
Right. He, let's see. Right. Here it is called Mount Sinai. Another name is in Exodus. What is it called in Exodus?
Horeb, Mount
Yeah,
of God.
Horeb.
Mountain.
Yeah, Horeb, the mountain of God. Yes. The arrow near Midian is where Mount Sinai is. The other arrow is where Israel and Jerusalem will be. Did God talk to Moses in the area that will be Israel and Jerusalem?
No,
Is there a Jerusalem temple where Moses was?
no. Then the Lord said to him, "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. I have indeed seen the opposition of my people in Egypt. I have heard their groaning and have come down to set them free. Now come, I will send you back to Egypt.
Why did God tell Moses to take off his sandals? Because it was holy ground. It was a sign of respect. In those days, and still in present cultures, you take off your shoes when you enter a person's home to leave the dirt of the world outside. Holy ground, is there a temple there?
No,
Is this the future promised land of Israel?
no,
Who commissioned Moses to go to Egypt?
God.
Okay, go ahead and complete number 4.
I have heard their groaning and have come down to set them free.
This same phrase could be used for Jesus the Messiah. What did God both see and hear?
The opposition of his people and their groaning.
Where are the people that God both sees and hears?
Egypt.
Why is Stephen bringing up this defense?
The holy ground is where God says it's holy ground.
Right. Yes. Holy ground doesn't mean that there's a temple there. That's not where the Jerusalem temple is. And yet God says it's holy ground, you know? And that can God hear his people even if they're not in Israel? Yes. They were in Egypt. He could hear their groaning. So even though Moses knew of God's plan for his life around the age of 40, it took 40 more years of trials and isolation before God was ready to use him. We would have thought that Moses would have been perfect at the task God had for him at the age of 40, but then who would have received the glory? Many times God will use us when we have to lean on him daily to handle the job he has given us. It's true.
Okay. This is the same Moses they had rejected with the words, "Who made you ruler and judge?" He was sent to be their ruler and deliverer by God himself through the angel who appeared to him in the bush. He led them out of Egypt and performed wonders and signs in Egypt, at the Red Sea, and for 40 years in the wilderness.
Who sent Moses?
God,
Who sent Jesus?
God.
Moses was able to do what in Egypt, at the Red Sea, and in the wilderness?
Perform wonders and signs in Egypt and 40 years in the wilderness.
Was Jesus able to do signs and wonders?
Yeah.
Were the signs and wonders just a one-time occurrence for Moses?
No.
Did Jesus only do signs and wonders one time or throughout his ministry?
Throughout his ministry.
Did the people reject Moses?
Yes.
Did they reject Jesus?
Yes.
Moses was the leader of his people, as Jesus was, is, and will be the leader of his people?
Was and is.
And will be too. Yeah.
Okay, last page. This is the Moses who told the Israelites, God will rise up for you a prophet like me from your own people. He was in the assembly in the wilderness with the angel who spoke to him on Mount Sinai and with our ancestors, and he received living words to pass on to us.
The full scripture that Moses tells his people is in Deuteronomy 18, 17 through 19. Deuteronomy 18, 17 through 19. The Lord said to me, what they say is good. I will raise up from them a prophet like you from among their fellow Israelites. I will put my words in his mouth. He will tell them everything I command him. I myself will call to account anyone who does not listen to my words that the prophet speaks in my name. Peter also uses this passage when he speaks to the people on the day of Pentecost in Acts 3:22. When Stephen is being accused of preaching against Moses, he responds basically by saying, no, I'm not preaching against Moses, but not only is he a good example of what I'm explaining to you, but he also prophesied of Jesus the Messiah. Was Moses uniquely designed from birth to deliver his people?
Yes.
Was Jesus uniquely designed from birth to deliver his people?
Yes.
Did the people first reject Moses?
Yes.
Did the people reject Jesus?
Yes.
Did Moses come back after he was rejected?
Yes.
Will Jesus be returning?
Yes.
So he's making a great defense, isn't he? So let me
Yep.
go ahead and, so that's the end of this chapter.
Yep.